With Maddox.
Wow.
Yeah. When Maddox first told me about the film, I asked him if he would send it to me, and he did, and I've watched it several times. It's really a treat. So let me introduce you to Chuck and Mary, and then we'll hear from Chuck about the research he did and came into contact with family, and then we'll hear from Mary about her perspective. And then finally Maddox will tell us a bit more about why he did this and any other thoughts that he has. Chuck Currier was my next door neighbor in the social studies building for many, many years. He grew up in Hermosa Beach, he went to Maricosta High School. He's Mr. Maricosta. It took us too many years to put him in the Hall of Fame, and finally we did in 2022. And Chuck's legacy here is the Maricosta History Project. When you were out in the foyer, you might have seen these books. It tells you how to obtain a copy if you like. And this is Chuck's baby. He got a lot of the people, including Mary, to help him write it. But there's more about the Ryomatsu story in here, and just so much to learn about the early years of Maricosta. So I highly recommend it to you. Mary, which has been such a treat for me to meet, and I told her I'm going to be calling you a lot in my role as ethnic studies teacher to get as much input as I can from you. Mary spent 30 years of her life in the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA and helped build it into the powerhouse that it is today. She was really well known for the graphic design work that she did. But more recently, she published a book, which is also out in the foyer, if you like to look at it, called Rockin' the Boat. She's a photographer, and it's a photographic journey into the Asian American movement from 1969 to 1974. And Mary is such an effective advocate and speaker, both by word and by photograph. So Chuck, I'd like to turn it over to you to start. Tell us a little bit about how you got connected to this story. Go for it.
Is my mic on?
Chuck, I'm sorry, this is really loud feedback coming from the
Speaker.
speaker.
We're trying to-
We'll turn that off.
We're trying to isolate what it is.
Oh, okay.
It was Maddox. Maybe at NYU they'll teach him. So, first off, very few people know that Francis Uematsu graduated from Maricosta. I'm just kidding. We would have liked to have it though. So all of this started very innocently, as many things do. A little over 20 years ago, we had some issue, before the school board having to do with, what kids from what neighborhoods around Maricosta should be able to attend Maricosta. And, in the olden days, all the neighborhoods around Maricosta all attended Maricosta because the three beach cities, Hermosa, Manhattan, and Redondo, were part of a single high school district. So we had three high schools, and there was never an issue. In other words, if you were on this street to this street, they were coming here. However, when we dissolved the high school district and then unified, and each city had its own school district, then it becomes a little stickier. Well, this area used to go here, and now, they need a special agreement. And anyway, I found, having grown up in the area, that bothered me a lot. So I started doing a whole bunch of research into, well, how exactly was Maricosta built? How was it financed? Who was tax money paid for it? And, I quickly determined, hey, you're telling somebody who lives 80 feet from Maricosta that they now need to go to Redondo High School when those families in those neighborhoods paid to build this place. You know, in other words, actually everybody in all three cities paid to build this place. So that didn't go all that well, but within a few years we resolved that. Things just take time. But in doing that, I got very interested in sitting over there at the Little Red Schoolhouse and going through these newspapers from right after World War II. I mean, it's kind of like sit there and go through them for hours and hours, and pretty soon I was noticing that I was reading the classified ads and you know, holy cow, porterhouse steak was 19 cents a pound. So I was like, what am I doing? So anyway, at that point, I kind of committed in my mind, hey, we ought to write a history of Maricosta. But this was a long time ago, and I was always a little bit worried, because if you open your mouth at the wrong time, next thing you know, you'll have to do what you just said. And I thought, this may not be very easy. But eventually, around 2014, I just simply started doing the research myself, and having a real estate background, I thought, you know what, I've always heard a story about, you know, we bought the land from a family that was interned at Tule Lake, and, you know, and on, but it was just a story, and it really was not formalized anywhere, so I dug into it. So first I got the name of the family off the deed. Then I started trying to figure out how would I know if they're at Tule Lake or not, when were they there. So a telephone call to the Japanese American Museum in downtown LA, and I get a researcher on the phone. He and I talked for about an hour. He gives me tons of information. They have all the databases. They know where everybody was, what camp, how long, when they entered. And we determined they were in Manzanar. He sends me a whole bunch of the intake papers. And before we get off the phone, he just says to me, have you ever thought of trying to find one of the family members? I laughed. I said, do you realize how old even the children would be at this point in time? That was World War II. And he goes, you might be surprised. And it just stuck in my head. You know, I thank you, I hung up the phone. Within about 20 minutes, you know, I'm checking public records on archives.com. And sure enough, I sort of go through the list, okay, died, but pretty soon I'm realizing, boy, you know, these people are living a long time, and it's not, you know, like decades ago. I'm getting very close to the current day, and I haven't found all of them in the death records yet. Sounds, you know, rather tragic. Finally, I can't find one of them, and it's a daughter. I thought, oh wow, now I'm into, you know, marriage records and different names, and so I thought, you know what? I'm just going to Google her name. Bam, she popped up. There she was, with an address and everything. I sent her a letter explaining what I'm doing, who I am, and I'm not the Night Stalker. And so about a month goes by, and I thought, you know what? Just like everything on the internet, you know, the addresses are old, the numbers are not the right ones, it's really not this person. I'm sitting at my desk in my room here at Maricosta, and all of a sudden, I look at my email. The subject line says, "You found me." So, I mean, I'm like, it's like Christmas, you know, and I open the email and she says, I'm the one you're looking for, you know, that was my family, you know, we owned that land. And we started emailing back and forth, and I mean, I'll tell you what, I was totally hooked. I mean, I really just wanted to kind of know about, you know, how did we buy the property and who the family was. The next thing I know, the Uematsu part of my research just begins to inflate like a balloon. And I mean, I even told them at that point, I said, I think the history of Maricosta is going to start with the Uematsus. So within a couple of years, I meet them. We all get together at Claremont University, Claremont Colleges. And I mean, it was really very, very cool. I'd been talking with Marion, her name's Mayor Uematsu. At that time, she was 87. I pull up in my car in the parking lot at Claremont, and a car pulls in right next to me. I turn to my left. She turns and looks right at me. We both get out of the car and walk right up to each other and hug. And I am not a huggy person. So this is an event. So we meet for, we probably sit in a room with, Mary and her sister were there, Mayor was there, my wife was there. 2 hours of talking went by like it was 5 minutes. And, we just talked about, their lives, what they're doing, and how this all came to be. So that is how the whole project and the Uematsu story started. And it has continued now for, 8 years. And I still find out new things on almost a monthly basis. It really took about 7 years before I actually knew the sale price or the purchase price of the 40 acres that we're sitting on. So unbelievable how much time some of that takes. But the most interesting thing that I have had in my hands or been able to read is just within the last year, Mary gave me the complete file of all letters that went in and out of Manzanar from her grandfather, over 250 letters going back and forth between his attorney and his accountant who's running the business while he's not there. And if you want to know how far will the IRS chase you, the IRS goes to Manzanar and meets with him in person with other government officials in the room, everything being transcribed, and part of it being translated by Francis Uematsu's oldest daughter, because Francis is not fluent enough to be in a high-speed discussion or negotiation, so she is always making sure they're all on the same page. But amazing to be that far into it, exactly what is being said, exactly how he explains his whole life story, which is how it is with the IRS. You have to explain your life story as to how you owe them so much money. So that is the origin of the research, the origin of the excitement about it, and it's still just as exciting today, and still more to learn. And as I was even saying to Mary today, things that I look at today look entirely different to me when I read some of Francis's letters, when I'm looking at all of the research I've already done. I see things that didn't jump out at me because now there are things that I understand that 8 or 9 years ago I had a different idea in my head. One, for instance, before I throw the ball back, at our when we met in Claremont, do you remember I asked Mayor, do you ever remember, can you give me some instances of when you were discriminated against? This is a white kid from Hermosa Beach wants to know what it's like to be discriminated against. And I remember she turned to you kind of like, what is he talking about? And I suddenly realized, you don't know that you're being discriminated against. I'm asking her to tell me about something that is happening around, behind, over, under, hidden. That's why it is so nasty, okay? And yet to me, it was like, tell me a few times when you were discriminated against. And yet finally she said, I remember that I called up to rent an apartment because she was going to UCLA. And she said, I called up, talked to the man. He said, come on down and meet me at the apartment. It's available. And by the time she drove down 30 minutes later, holy cow, it had already been rented. And she said, that happened all the time. So it was sort of like, wow, now I see, I didn't get it before.
Chuck, do you want to talk a little bit about the plaque and how that came about, or do you want to wait till we all have stuff?
Either way, the plaque really went like this. After all of the information, all of the, relationships and everything, at some point it was like, there ought to be a historic plaque on our campus, that recognizes this incredible period of time during, our history. And as Maddox mentioned in the documentary, it's not just about the Japanese internment. Originally, that's what I thought it was about. That's what I was spending a lot of time learning about. Even my wife and I have been to Manzanar many times. It all started 100 years before that. We ran the Chinese right out of the United States, and they used the same playbook and turned it on the Japanese. So if we were going to have a plaque, I wanted it to be huge because I wanted it to have a story. I didn't want it to say Francis Uematsu, once stood on this spot or something like that. So we put a monument large enough that you get the idea of what it was like to be Francis Uematsu and what he was able to do during his lifetime. And we had it. School board said, we like that. That's a great idea. We put it dead center in the middle of our 40-acre campus, and we'll go out there in a very short period of time and admire it. And the other part of going out there is in a city where we all talk about the measurement of our property in terms of feet. Francis Uematsu owned 120 acres, where the distance down one side of his property from Artesian Boulevard up Peck to 2nd Street is a half of a mile. Okay? So feet meant nothing back then, and he, after all those years in the business, was able to come to Manhattan Beach and buy 120 acres.
Thank you. Mary, with all due respect to Chuck, you're the star. This is your family story. What would you like to share with us?
Okay, well, I kind of prepared a chronology of my understanding of my grandfather and his work because, when you're growing up in the family, you hear different stuff, but you don't really hear it, and when you're a kid, a lot of it just like, going over your head is like, that's family stuff, right? And so it wasn't really until meeting Chuck, and also there's a Professor Wendy Chang who started doing research on my grandfather, and it was through them that I was really able to learn a lot more. Just to share some of his history, his first wife was Miyoko, and this was an arranged marriage, and they had a daughter named Sonoko. And my Aunt Sonoko later on married someone that my grandfather did not approve of, and so her family basically grew up in the East Coast and were had much harder life than the rest of the Uematsus that were still connected with nursery. My grandfather's second wife was Kuniko, so you see her in the pictures. And what's interesting to me is that their marriage was based on what he called in principle a mutual understanding. In other words, not an arranged marriage. I'm not sure, but I think it might have also been my grandmother's second marriage also. And so anyways, from the second marriage was the birth of my father, who was the eldest son, Alice, Star, Marion, and Sam. So they have 5 children. Sonoko, she had a huge family. She raised 6 kids on the East Coast in Seabrook, New Jersey. And Somerville and her husband both worked in a frozen food factory all their lives. Because of the internment camps, a lot of the Nisei, which is the second generation, that's my parents' generation, really, a lot of them didn't want to teach their kids Japanese, or they didn't see the point of it. They wanted to be American. We had come out of the war where Japanese were the enemy, and so they wanted to try and fit in as easily as possible. And so my parents did not teach us Japanese. They spoke it as a secret language at the dinner table when they didn't want my sister and I to know what they were talking about. So, it's kind of a negative reinforcement on learning Japanese to this day. My husband is Chinese, speaks more Japanese than I do, which really should make me learn when I have it. So some of my biggest memories of my grandfather was when we would go see him, which was not real often, but they didn't live that far. But to show how happy he was to see me, he would grab my cheeks. So I have vivid memories of that. And then I remember one time they had just returned from a trip to Japan, which they did a lot of. And we had picked them up from the airport. And as soon as we got to their house, he jumped out of the car and he ran into his greenhouse. So I'm telling you this because this shows how much he loved his plants. That was his lifeblood, really. And also, just to speak to his stamina, he died when he was 98. But in his 90s, the family had to put him into a nursing home because he was, getting dementia, and he was starting to hit my grandmother with a cane. And so they moved him, and just to show how strong he was, it took 2 male nurses to hold him, to give him a shower. And he was, smaller than me, a very tiny, small framed man. My sister was the first grandchild on the West Coast. And for, the first 12 years of my life, we did not know that we had relatives living on the other side of the country in Seabrook. And I don't know why my dad didn't want to tell us, but it was one of these, I guess, ghosts in the closet, the family closet. Anyway, so as my sister was the first grandchild, that she more or less took up the responsibility of knowing about Grandpa's work. I was, the baby of the family, and so I didn't bother myself with these responsibilities. And she had actually had a pamphlet of an oral history that Grandpa did when he was, I think it was even in his 90s when he did it, but anyways, a group in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, they did his oral history, and Amy had it translated into English, and she gave me a copy. At the time, my kids were small. I was, busy mom, and so I basically threw it in a drawer and it sat there for years. I worked at UCLA for 30 years, Asian American Studies Center, and never once went to the special collections to see his box of papers that belonged to the Japanese American Research Project. Because I was getting involved in, helping establish ethnic studies and getting involved in the anti-war movement, and also the Asian American movement, which was just starting to bud at the time. So, up until recently, I was not that attached to his story, really. Lee McCarthy published a story in the LA Times magazine, which featured one of my sister's poems about Grandpa. And she talked about, Grandpa's camellias being at Descanso Gardens. And also Naomi Hirahara has written a lot also about And then when Chuck Courier contacted Aunt Marion, and the mayor, hooked us into the conversation of emails, and that really started the whole ball rolling. And I started writing for the Rafushimbo, the Japanese daily newspaper, which is the only surviving Japanese daily newspaper today. All the rest have folded or gone online. But I think because I started writing for the Rafu, then, I'm looking for material for articles to write. And, here's Chuck, bringing up my grandpa, and I was like, wow, here's a story. Wendy Chang also, through Amy's poetry, started investigating and researched this Council Gardens connection. And she came to UCLA campus while I was still working there, and she said, Mary, let's go to special collections and see your grandpa's, what's in your grandpa's box. And so there I go. So this is people pushing me in this direction instead of, out of my own whatever. Wendy Chang, she's been very instrumental. She wrote an article about, the landscapes of plunder, and she talked about, Descanso Gardens in Manchester Bodie, and she questioned, because they used to have an exhibit in the Bodie House at Descanso Gardens, which said that F.M. Wamatsu had tears in his eyes because he was so happy that Manchester Bodie bought his communities. And, that rubbed her wrong. And then when she told me, I was like, oh, God, it's terrible, right? And so she started working with them. She met with the board, and they read her article, and she had a lot of research in there. She's actually the one who provided Chuck and myself with the file of letters, which is actually the War Relocation Authority. So all the letters all correspondence that took place while people were in the concentration camps are in those WRA files. I still haven't read it all. Chuck's read it. It's a huge file. So then we had the monument, the dedication. It's like beyond what I had ever expected to happen here. It was pretty amazing, and Chuck was really a standout in terms of, really getting this whole thing together. And when we had the meeting, the school board meeting where they passed, doing the monument, we actually had relatives from Somerville's family in the East Coast on that Zoom. So that was also significant that, we had family members from both coasts at that meeting via Zoom. Okay, and then who would have expected that, I never expected that after the monument was built, that there would be such an immediate impact, which was Maddox doing this film. It was unbelievable. And when he first approached me to do an interview, I didn't do any research on Maddox. I was happy to be interviewed, that someone was, interested in my grandpa's story, and I figured it wasn't gonna go this far. I didn't Google him, so I didn't know what kind of kid he was. I mean, I didn't realize how accomplished he was. But, he came and did the interview, and then before I knew it, he says, well, it's gonna be in these different film festivals. And it's like, wow. So the whole thing has been, very pleasant journey. I think I've learned a lot. I've met a lot of people out of this whole thing that, it's just been very rewarding. And I know my grandfather and the family is very appreciative. My Aunt Marion said, wow, you know, if Grandpa could have only seen just a little bit of this recognition while he was still alive. Because he was, you know, at that point, he was pretty much a forgotten man. So the impact that Maddox has done has been amazing. And my gratitude really to Chuck, to Wendy, and to Maddox for really cementing Grandpa's legacy into our local history in a much more permanent way.
Mary, as I listened to your story, all the work that you did with the Asian American Studies Center, educating the public about the Asian American experience and struggles, which you've now put in a book as well, and then going through this whole process with Chuck and the story of your grandfather. I wonder if you might talk a minute about the significance of this in today's world for you. The story of, a tragic story, in a way, and Chuck described what your grandfather did against all odds to become a very successful person, just to have all that taken away, but maintain his resilience. I mean, in today's world, why is it important for us to hear this story?
Well, I've thought about how to put this. And I guess the thought I have is that we used to, or I used to, say when my father took over the nursery. Now, he took over the nursery because he was the first son. And, you know, Japanese tradition is that's what you do. And even though it was not his passion, he, you know, he carried out what he was supposed to do. And I used to say, well, you know, my dad took over the nursery and he drove it into the ground. Which is really unfair. To his credit, he maintained the nursery and it gave a livelihood to not only our family, but to Mare and her husband and Sam and his wife. And so, you know, it continued to provide for the family until 1985. But he reduced, you know, he obviously didn't love plants the way Grandpa did. And so he pretty much, by the end of the remaining years of the nursery, it was reduced down to basically one stock, which is the tam juniper, which you cannot destroy in freezing weather. It's just, you know. And, you know, that was how he kept the nursery going, you know. So he didn't have this love like, you know, Grandpa did for propagating and, you know, all this stuff. So without understanding like the larger forces that are at work, and understanding, you know, the way our government, the U.S. government, has dealt with people of color in this country, as well as working people, that you tend to blame yourselves. That's why I would blame my dad, instead of not seeing that there were much larger historical forces at work, causing, you know, the losses of the family. And so I think what's important in terms of knowing these stories, and I think everybody can dig into their past and find these stories that took place here. And a lot of the government policies that put us into camp are still at work. They still exist today. And so in understanding and knowing this history, we can start seeing that, you know, we have a lot more in common with each other as the majority of the people, regardless of, you know, all these differences. And that it's really the people coming together to understand that We have power to change things if we can only come together and see that, you know, the sources of our oppression is not us, right? But it's the government that is not working in our favor.
Maddox, in a minute, I'm gonna ask you a similar question, including why you chose to make this film, but I wanna talk for a minute about Mary's sister Amy, who, well, she was a math teacher at LUSD for 30 years and another Bruin. She's most well known as a poet, actually so well known in the Los Angeles poetry community that when she unfortunately passed recently, there was a wonderful appreciation written by her in the Los Angeles Times. It was published last month. I highly recommend it to you. And it led me to read a lot of her work. She wrote quite a bit about the Japanese American experience, advocated for her own political views, as well as only a great poet can weave in culture and nature and ethnicity with injustice in a really powerful way. And so I asked Mary if it'd be okay if I read one of her sister's poems, and she said yes, by all means. So this is a poem called A Recent Conversation with My Grandmother by Amy Wiemans. When I wake up in mid-dream or find myself humming a melody with no sharps or flats, I know I've been outside of this time. If only I could speak with Oba-chan, not be groping inside this buried place for the carelessly thrown out language of immigrants. Only 2 generations since leaving Shizuoka. She knew I would go back to Izu Peninsula, climb the slopes of Omurayama with my mother's cousin, the wind slapping my hair, hard against my face, no sound from the ocean below as the wind moans through the long mountain grass. I can't say the words. We gave up a language well suited to farmers and poets, its rhythm uneven with brushstrokes and pause. It holds sound inside picture with 1,000 possibilities for shadow and light. Instead, I must use these words with no memory. That's from her award-winning collection called 30 Miles from Jimbo. Matt, tell us a little bit more about why you chose this project for yourself and why you think it's important.
Sorry. So, like Chuck and Mary mentioned before, I kind of started getting into this film just by passing the Platte, which was actually right in front of my English classroom senior year. So it was actually junior year. I walked past it a few times, and I had no idea what it was. And then I kind of got curious after probably like the 3rd or 4th pass, and I actually read the story out. And I thought it was really interesting because I had literally no idea about it. And I don't think many of my classmates did either. So I thought it'd be a really important story to kind of make into a film. And I was fortunate enough to be taking a USC documentary class the following summer, where I was able to work on the documentary and get help from all these amazing people. So I could actually like make a good documentary and not what I usually make. And that happened through just reaching out to Chuck and Mary. For the people my age, I'm gonna sound really old, but I use Facebook to contact Mary. And it was really just all of Chuck's research and Mary's help that I was able to put together the story. When I went to interview Chuck, I think the total footage was like at least 2 hours, and Mary's was not 2 hours, but it was just I was able to get all of this information that really helped me put the story into perspective. And probably the biggest issue just came around to like chopping everything down and making it into a really short documentary, which thankfully I was able to do. And I kind of stated it earlier, but I think really important that I would to make this documentary because just because not a lot of people here, even in this community, really knew about Francis Dewey Montague. I mean, I didn't. I asked a lot of my classmates and people around here if they had no idea until they actually watched the documentary. So I think it's really important to have kind of knowledge of the past, just because of how like significant it is in the present. I mean, I didn't really think about it, but Francis Dewey Montague kind of has impacted me every day because it was his land that I've been walking on and going to class and just doing everyday things. It's really not something you think about until you actually look into it. So I think that just goes for any things in the past. Just I was talking to my mom about it, and she used kind of the analogy of throwing the rock into the pond, and there's just all these ripples, and the ripples are still coming to us today. So it's just really important to have kind of that knowledge and understanding of the past, just because of how prominent it is in our present.
Great. Very good. We're close to the time that we were going to walk outside, but why don't we take a couple of questions, and then any others we'll be happy to answer them outside as we all go to the plaque. Yes.
Has your family ever talked about their experiences at Nansemond? If you don't mind sharing, and what did they talk about? You know.
Not a lot. My father was there briefly, and I mean, he would be the main person I would be able to, find out from, because my mother was a healer. But he left pretty early to work on the sweet potato farms in, I think, Idaho, because there was a work shortage, right, because of the war. And so he didn't spend a lot of time there. My mother talked about it, but what she told us was she had the time of her life. She had fun, she had all these boyfriends, she was like 15, 16 years old, right? And it was the first time that a lot of people were in a large concentration of Japanese, right? And so for the kids, a lot of them, it was like a party, right? And they partied. Right? And that's when the Asian American movement came along, and I was arguing with my parents, like, the whole thing was wrong, but you were having fun. So anyway.
Yes, Karen.
What's the actual perimeter of the acreage?
Here,
Yeah, I see it on the map.
Oh.
What do we know
What-
today?
what you see outlined is the Miracosta campus. Francis Uematsu's property was 3 times that. So 2 more 40-acre squares, one all the way up to 2nd Street, and then pretty much like an upside-down L. You owned all that, Setchers, the hill, everything up on the top of that hill.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One of them is, did your grandfather feel that he had to sell? Because somewhere, I think in the documentary, he had an accountant or somebody to watch over the business. But was it something he could not keep the land? He was forced to sell, or he felt it was the best thing to sell at the time?
He was in camp, and he was basically forced to sell because he had debts. He had left his nursery in the hands of a white accountant who some people say saw my grandfather as the enemy, right? And so there was a lot of inside, embezzlement, I'm sure, and so he ended up in debt and he had to sell. I mean, they even had my grandparents had to sell their life insurance also.
And so the second question is, your grandfather's name is Francis, and it's not Japanese. Why Is that?
He was actually baptized as a Catholic in Japan. Yeah.
There you
Don't
go.
ask me why.
Yeah, even more far-reaching than the IRS.
No,
My question is for Maddox. This was really well done. Congratulations to you. And my question for you is, have you any interest in doing documentaries in the future? And if so, have you thought about any subject?
Yeah, no, I really loved making this documentary, and I definitely know I'll be making more documentaries in the future, just as well as all the other genres of film. But as far as what I'm doing next, I'm not really sure. I have some ideas, and my family's given me some ideas, so maybe they'll do something more with more of a personal connection to me, but no, nothing yet.
yes, sir.
So I'm gonna ask Mary, I assume that your grandparents lived on the land, 120 acres, right? They did not live there?
No, they did not.
Where did they live?
They were living on the original nursery property, which was Montebello.
Okay, so they lived there while they had the land down here.
Right.
Now, when they came out of the internment camp, where did they go?
They went back to Montebello.
Okay.
And the thing is I was just thinking, he bought the property, I think it was 1938.
1940, here.
That was 1938.
That was originally until I got it right. Ballpark, ballpark.
So the thing is he really didn't have the property that long, and he had just finished, getting all the iron pipes for the irrigation and all that done 1941. So a year before Pearl Harbor, right? It was like a year and 8 months that he had finally gotten everything ready to really, start planting stuff. And get it working.
Last one there, and then we'll take the rest outside. Go ahead.
How long did the overall film take?
To make?
Question.
Tape to me.
It was. Let me count the months actually. It was about a 5-month project. Mainly because school happened, so it's kind of on and off. But basically, I started late June at the USC class where I had to come up with an idea. I researched it, I pitched it to the class. The professor obviously approved it, and then I had to reach out, get filming done, which I had to film an interview at Chuck's, I had to film an interview at Mary's. I was able to get some footage of various flowers around LA, and then a little bit at Maricosta as well. And then what took the longest, because that kind of wrapped up in July, is the editing. If you're not familiar, documentary editing is actually the worst, just because of how much you have to do, and kind of the fact that you don't really have a full planned out story until you get to the editing, until you have everything. Because it's a real story, so you can't plan it and see where it's gonna go. So documentary editing is really where you put together the story, and just kind of taking from Chuck's very long interview and Mary's interview as well, and just being able to maybe pace it so that people will actually watch it. Ended up being kind of a big challenge, but I was able to get some help and input from my professor, and in October is when I was able to put everything together. And then I said it was a 5-month process, but there's even more after that, where you got to submit to all of these film festivals and reach out to get screenings like this, because this is a full year after the project started, so it's just kind of been doing stuff ever since then.
Oh, yes, it's yours.
Well, let's give everyone a round of applause. such a wonderful story to hear about and to learn just about the history and everything that has happened and to know exactly, what happened here on this land before Mercosted was established. So thank you so much for telling your story, Maddox and Chuck and everyone. Just thank you. We're now going to go over to the plaque that we have here on campus dedicated to Francis Uematsu. And the one wonderful thing that I do want to share is that we have camellias that are planted all around the plaque too. So take note of that when you go to look at the plaque. We also have refreshments there, and then we'll all be available for further questions. So if you'd like, we can come on down and we'll walk you right over to the bus stand. Thank you for coming.